Hey everyone, and welcome to Worm Week. We're on to our first Worm Week worm phylum, the Platyhelminths, also known as the flatworms, and in this video we'll be talking about their phylogeny, bilateral symmetry, tissue layers, and their gut organization. Here's our hypothetical phylogeny, which we introduced last week. Here highlighting these major evolutionary innovations with multicellularity highlighted by the sponges. We've got distinct tissue layers highlighted in the Cnidaria. And in this session, the major evolutionary innovation we will consider in relation to the platyhelminths is bilateral symmetry. Here's this phylogenetic tree put together by Dunn et al. 2008 again. And remember, the molecular phylogenies you'll come across will likely not be quite so neat and straightforward as our idealized one that we based on the evolutionary innovations. For example, flatworms are actually placed in the clade alongside the annelid worms and mollusks in the Lophotrochozoa rather than alongside the nematodes. Looking a bit closer at the platyhelminths and the platyhelminth classes, there's approximately 20,000 described species of platyhelminth, and they are associated with aquatic and damp habitats. They're split across four classes. There's the free-living Turbellaria, and when I say free-living, I mean they don't need a host to survive. And then there's the parasitic classes of the platyhelminths. We've got the monogenia, which are mainly fish ectoparasites, meaning they live on the outside of their host organism. There's the trematodes, which are mainly endoparasites, meaning they live on the inside of their hosts. And there's the cestodes as well, which are also endoparasites, which are commonly referred to as the tapeworms. These parasitic platyhelminths are particularly important to us humans because many are ecto and endoparasites of either humans or the animals that we have domesticated. So human parasitism by platyhelminths is particularly important in the developing world, and making platyhelminths, although I don't really like the term, lower invertebrates, which have major health impacts or ramifications on another term I don't really like, higher vertebrates. So as I said, the Turbellaria are free-living flatworms, and they range from between half a millimeter to up to 60 centimeters long. Here's a dorsal view of one in the top left corner of the slide. And the Turbellaria means whirlpool, and they get this name because when they beat their cilia, which are on the underside of their body, these small, tiny particles whirl around them like a whirlpool, and that's where they get this name from. In the middle, we can see the anterior end or the scolex of a cestode, showing the attachment hooks surrounded by these four suckers, if you look close enough. There's a monogenia as well in the top right-hand side of the slide, which is hooked onto a fish, and a trematode as well, known as a schistosome, in the bottom right, which has been removed from the host blood vessel of its host organism. And here, this isn't just one schistosome. This is actually a pair, a male and a female, because they live permanently in copulation. So for the first part of this session, we'll be mainly focusing on the free-living turbellarians like Planaria, which you can see in the bottom left-hand corner of the slide, which are abundant in unpolluted ponds and streams. Then later in the session, we'll be having a look at the wonderful parasitic beasts, including the flukes, trematodes, and the tapeworms. So we're moving away from the simpler body plans of the Cnidarians, and again we're seeing another step or increase in complexity once again. So with the platyhelminths, we start to see bilateral symmetry. We've got three tissue layers rather than two. They are acoelomate, meaning they don't have a body cavity, similar to the sponges and the Cnidarians. They've got a blind ending gut, which we'll get to in a few slides' time. No circulatory system, but what they do have is the beginnings of muscles and a nervous system and a excretory system as well. So quite a few additional characteristics in the platyhelminths in comparison to the cnidarians. You may remember from our session on the cnidaria that the cnidaria are radially symmetrical, meaning that they have multiple planes of symmetry. So you can see this in the center of the slide where there's this polyp body-formed cnidarian with its multiple lines of symmetry. And then on the far right of the slide, we have these platyhelminths, which are bilaterally symmetrical. So they have a line of symmetry running along their anterior-posterior axis, so all the way down the middle of their body. In other words, they have a symmetrical right side and left side. And this is the most common type of symmetry we see in the metazoans, and it's considered a very important step, evolutionarily speaking. I'll get into why that is in a second. So bilateral symmetry occurred early on in the evolution of animals, and it's important as it allows creatures to move through their environment in a consistent direction, as you now have a front and a back alongside a top and a bottom. So having this anterior or front end leading the way as you move through your environment has its advantages, as if you have sensory organs located in this anterior end of your body leading to concentrations of nerve and sensory cells, then that is quite advantageous as this part of your body is the first to kind of move through your environment. It's the first to encounter anything, so it's beneficial to have these sensory structures at this anterior end. And this development of a head where you get these clusterings of nerves and sensory structures is called cephalization. And cephalization is often considered a consequence of the development of bilateral symmetry. And we will look at the nervous system of the platyhelminths in detail towards the end of the session, but just remember how we believe its development is associated with the evolution of this bilateral symmetry. So you're unlikely to get this cephalization without first having some degree of bilateral symmetry. So as I said earlier, we have 3 tissue layers in the platyhelminths, making them triploblastic rather than diploblastic, which we saw in the cnidarians. And these 3 cell layers are the epidermis, which forms the outer layer of the platyhelminths, the gastrodermis, which lines the gut of the platyhelminths, and then in between this gastrodermis and epidermis, we have this additional layer known as the mesoderm. And I just want to point out that this mesoderm layer is distinct from the mesoglia layer that we saw in the cnidaria, which isn't a true tissue, whereas this mesoderm layer is a true tissue layer. Here's how these tissue layers are organized. We've got this epidermis on the outside in green, the gut on the inside surrounded by this gastrodermis, which you can see in blue, and this peachy mesoderm in between. You may have noticed these additional words next to the names of these tissue layers, and these refer to the early development of these tissue layers, which we refer to as embryological germ layers. This term mesoderm actually refers to the origin of this tissue in the embryo, in these embryological germ layers, which you may have encountered during your life processes sessions. So in an adult platyhelminth, there's no tissue that is mesoderm, rather there is tissue like muscle or reproductive structure that is mesoderm in origin. When it comes to the other tissue layers during this embryological development, the epidermis is embryologically known as ectodermal tissue, and the gastrodermis is embryologically endodermal tissue. So just to highlight that we use different terms for the different stages of development for these tissue layers. In the platyhelminth triploblastic body, there is no body cavity. That is, there's no space between the ectodermal and endodermal tissue. And because of this absence of body cavity, the platyhelminths are said to be acoelomate. So the platyhelminths are acoelomate because they don't have a coelom, which is the name of this body cavity that we'll come across later down the line. And we'll start to see this a little bit in the nematodes and finally properly meet a coelom in the annelids. And as the name suggests, flatworms also have a flattened body. So this circular arrangement that you see in the middle of the slide is just to communicate these different tissue layers, but actually in real life it looks more like what you see underneath this flattened body plan. So the flatworms have this relatively simple body plan. One thing they don't have is a circulatory system. They rely on diffusion between cells for nutrient transport. And diffusion is quite rapid at cell and simple tissue levels, but it's slower over greater distances as diffusion is proportional to the square of the distance. So it gets much and much slower as it tries to transport things over a greater distance. So without a circulatory system to transport oxygen or CO2, they've evolved this flattened shape to allow more efficient diffusion to occur even as they increase in size. So this flattened body plan creates this larger surface area, so more gas exchange can occur via diffusion. So in this slide, we see the gut of a free-living platyhelminth, and this gut only has one opening, which is the mouth, which you find in the center of the platyhelminth body, which is a bit strange as you'd expect it to be in this anterior end, but it's actually kind of where you would expect their belly button to be. And because there's only one opening to this gut, then any undigested food must be digested through the mouth. And in this photo here, so this is a free-living flatworm that's ingested a dye so that you can see all this intricate gut with all its many different chambers and lobes that are spread out throughout the body of the platyhelminth to allow these nutrients to spread around the body. So that's it for this video. Next up, you'll be looking at platyhelminth muscles, movement, nerves, and body plan.